The Duke's deaf son was told he'd never hear again. The maid no one noticed proved them all wrong. Every morning at 6:30, Lord Edmund Ashworth pressed 2 fingers to his right temple and held them there. Every afternoon when the East Corridor draft came through, his jaw tightened in the particular way of someone who has learned that pain is simply the weather, unpleasant, constant, and not worth mentioning because there is no one to mention it to. He had been doing this for 7 months. 3 physicians had examined him in 4 years and declared his condition permanent, and his silence the natural consequence of it. No one had thought to look closer. Clara Voss had been in the house 11 days when she did. The boy was screaming when Clara first saw him. Not with his voice. Lord Edmund Ashworth had not spoken aloud in 4 years, not because the fever had taken his voice along with his hearing, but because silence, once it became the only world he knew, had seemed the safest thing to stay inside. He could speak. He had simply chosen not to, in the particular way of a child who has discovered that the world grows very uncomfortable when it cannot hear itself in you. He screamed with his body instead, fists balled white against the marble floor, back arched against the leg of his father's great mahogany desk, jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched visibly below his ear. He was 12 years old and rigid with a pain no physician in 3 counties had yet been able to name. Clara Voss stood in the doorway of the Duke's study holding a tray of afternoon correspondence and did not move. The footman had simply left the boy there, she would later learn. They did not know what to do with him. They did not want to be blamed for whatever happened next. Clara set the tray down on the side table without a sound. She crossed the room. She sat on the floor beside him, not across from him, not kneeling above him, but beside him, her back against the same desk leg, her shoulder 6 inches from his. And she did nothing, said nothing, simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, breathing steadily, as if the marble floor of Ashworth House was a perfectly reasonable place to spend a Tuesday afternoon. The boy's fists did not unclench for a long time, but they did, eventually, uncurl. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we came to that floor, and what it cost us both to rise from it. Ashworth House in November was a thing of clenched beauty, all grey stone and frost-edged windows, the rose gardens stripped to their thorns, the fountain in the East Court drained and silent. Clara Voss had arrived on the 3rd of the month, her single trunk strapped to the back of the carrier's cat, her references carefully folded in the breast pocket of her coat. She was 19. She had come from the smaller house of a lesser family in Derbyshire, where she had learned, above all things, to move quietly and notice much. The housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, a woman whose spine appeared to have been replaced at birth with a length of iron railing, received Clara in the servants' hall with the kind of efficient assessment that left one feeling both thoroughly catalogued and entirely overlooked. "You'll be 3rd housemaid," Mrs. Garrett said, not looking up from her ledger. 3rd housemaids are not seen and not heard, particularly in the family wing. Lord Edmund's rooms are on the 2nd floor, East Corridor. You will not enter unless specifically directed. You will not attempt to communicate with him in any fashion. The boy is. Here she paused, selecting her word with the care of a woman choosing which piece of silverware to use. Difficult. Difficult, Clara repeated. Mrs. Garrett's pen stopped. Yes. Difficult. I understood he is deaf. He is. And prone to fits of temper that have caused 3 of the previous maids to give notice. His Grace has very particular requirements regarding the management of the household around Lord Edmund's condition. Those requirements do not include conversation, curiosity, or sympathy. Do I make myself plain? Perfectly plain. Clara was given her uniform, black dress, white apron, cap that sat slightly too large, and shown to her room in the attic. From her single window she could see a strip of the East Corridor windows below. One of them, she noted, had a light behind it still, at nearly 10 o'clock at night. She watched it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she unpacked her trunk. His Grace the Duke of Ashworth was 43, recently returned from 18 months on the continent following the death of his wife, and moved through his own house with the careful courtesy of a man visiting somewhere he had not been invited. He was not unkind. He was simply absent in all the ways that mattered, his attention dispersed among parliamentary obligations, correspondence, the management of 3 estates, and the persistent, grinding guilt of a father who did not know how to love a son he could not reach. Edmund had been 8 when the fever took his hearing. Before that, by all household accounts, he had been a boy of extraordinary energy, quick with questions, loud with laughter, perpetually underfoot in the kitchens and the stables, a creature of unchecked delight who had not yet learned to be anything other than entirely himself. The fever changed that in 10 days. The silence that followed was not only Edmund's. The Duke had not known how to speak to his son before sign language, and he had not troubled himself to learn it after. They communicated now through notes passed on silver trays, through the intermediary of a tutor who had lasted 2 years and then resigned, citing irreconcilable difficulties with the pupil's temperament, and through the elaborate, exhausting performance of normalcy. Dinners at which Edmund sat and ate in total isolation from the conversation around him, drawing rooms in which he was present and utterly invisible. The pain, it turned out, was his ears. Or rather, the scar tissue left behind by the fever, and a secondary infection that had been improperly treated, and the particular way the cold November air moved through the stone corridors of Ashworth House directly past the east wing windows, which were ancient and draughty and leaked weather like a sieve. Edmund had been living with a low, constant headache for months that spiked, on bad days, into something altogether worse. The physicians had missed it because they did not ask him. They asked his father, who did not know, who asked the butler, who had not been told. No one had thought to ask Edmund himself. Clara had been in the house 11 days when she began to suspect. It was the way he held his head. She had learned, those first 11 days, to move through the east corridor efficiently and without incident. She had learned that Lord Edmund rose at 6:30 and could be heard. By the subtle vibrations of footsteps she had trained herself to feel rather than hear, moving to his writing desk by 7. She had learned that he preferred his fire laid before he came down, that he disliked the smell of the linseed oil used to polish the side table nearest his window, and that he had a habit, when deep in concentration, of pressing 2 fingers to his right temple in a gesture so habitual it had worn a faint mark there, a slight reddening of the skin. She had learned all of this by watching, by being, as Mrs. Garrett had instructed, invisible. But invisibility, Clara had always understood, was not the same as blindness. The tilt of his head when the draught came through was not the tilt of someone cold. It was the tilt of someone flinching from something internal, something pressing outward from inside the skull. She recognized it because her younger brother had done the same, once, with an abscess in his jaw that had taken 3 weeks to properly diagnose. The same slight rotation away from the source of pain, the same jaw set of someone managing rather than admitting. On the 12th day, she found the boy in his father's study during a moment when the Duke was out on estate business and the footman had, once again, abandoned their post. Edmund was on the floor, not in the dramatic extremity of that first encounter, but in the quieter, more frightening version of it. Still, very still, with his knees drawn up and his forehead resting on them, and both hands pressed flat over his ears in a way that suggested pressure rather than blocking of sound. Clara considered the situation for approximately 4 seconds. She went to the fireplace. She selected 2 of the flat hearthstones, warm from the fire, smooth and substantial, and wrapped them carefully in her apron cloth. She crossed the room. She sat on the floor beside him, as she had before, and said nothing, and did nothing, except place one of the wrapped stones gently against the side of the desk where his head rested, so that if he chose to lean against it the warmth would reach his ear. She set the second stone in her lap and waited. A very long minute passed. Then, almost imperceptibly, Edmund shifted. His head turned fractionally. His temple came to rest against the wrapped stone. Clara kept her breathing even. She did not look at him directly. She watched the fire and kept the second stone warm in her lap and thought about nothing in particular, or tried to. After 20 minutes, the rigidity had begun to leave his shoulders. After 30, he straightened. He looked at her, not with the suspicious, assessing look he gave most of the household staff, the look of someone who expected to be managed, to be worked around, to be treated as a problem requiring a solution, but with something more complicated, more careful. The look of someone who has been given something unexpected and is not yet certain whether it is safe to want it. Clara met his gaze steadily. She touched her own temple lightly with 2 fingers. Then she pointed, very gently, to his. A question. Not spoken. Not pitying. Simply, there. Edmund stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the smallest possible movement, the kind that could be denied if necessary, he nodded. She did not tell anyone immediately. This was not deception. She told herself this firmly, on the walk back to the servants' quarters with her apron properly restored and her expression as neutral as she could manage. It was simply that she did not yet know enough to tell anyone anything useful. A warm stone was not a diagnosis. A nod was not a medical history. What she needed was more information. What she needed was a way to communicate with him properly. That night, by the light of a single candle, she wrote a letter to her brother in Derbyshire and enclosed 2 shillings, money she had been setting aside for a new pair of winter stockings, with a request that he send her, as quickly as the post would allow, his copy of the manual alphabet for the deaf, which their schoolteacher had kept, and which she had borrowed and returned twice over the past decade. She had learned perhaps a quarter of it then, out of the idle curiosity that had always been her particular affliction, without ever imagining she would need it in earnest. While she waited for the book, she did what she could from memory. The Duke came to her, not the other way around. She had not expected that. She had imagined, in the bleak arithmetic of household politics, that her conversation with His Grace, if it ever occurred, would take place in Mrs. Garrett's office, mediated by the housekeeper's careful disapproval. She had not anticipated being summoned directly to the library at 4 o'clock on a Thursday, with no warning beyond a footman's stiff instruction and the time it took to wipe the ash from her hands. The Duke was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn immediately, which she recognized as the particular power play of men who had spent a great deal of time being waited for. When he did turn, she had the impression of a man who had once been handsome and was now merely distinguished, the good architecture still present but the warmth of it gone cold. "You are the 3rd housemaid," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Garrett informs me you have been spending time in the vicinity of my son's rooms rather more than your duties require." Clara kept her hands still at her sides. "I have been attentive to the cleanliness of the East Corridor, Your Grace." "My son is not the East Corridor." "No, Your Grace." A silence. The Duke studied her with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to reading people in the brief windows available to the powerful. "He has not screamed in 11 days, he said at last. "The footmen have noted it. Mrs. Garrett has noted it. I am noting it now and inquiring as to the cause." Clara considered her words with the care they deserved. "I believe Lord Edmund has been experiencing significant pain in his ears, Your Grace. I believe the cold draughts in the East Wing corridor aggravate the condition. I have been placing warm stones near the area when I observe him in discomfort, and I believe this has provided some small relief." The Duke went very still. "You believe," he said, "that he has been in pain?" "Yes, Your Grace." "For how long?" "I cannot say with certainty. Some months, I think. The way he holds himself in the cold. He has not told anyone." The Duke's voice had changed. The authority had left it, replaced by something rawer and less practiced. "He has not communicated this to anyone. He has no reliable means by which to do so, Your Grace," Clara said, carefully. "The signs he was taught appear to have been quite limited. He has a great deal more to say than he has been given the vocabulary to say it." Another silence, longer this time. The Duke turned back to the window. "You will continue," he said, "in whatever you have been doing. And you will," he stopped. His hands, she noticed, were clasped behind his back with a tension that whitened the knuckles. "You will tell me," he said, "if there is anything else he requires that has not been provided." "Yes, Your Grace. That will be all." She was at the door when he spoke again. "What is your name?" "Your full name." "Clara Voss, Your Grace." He did not respond. But she heard him exhale, slowly, heavily, like a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. The book arrived 8 days later. By Saturday morning she had filled in the gaps, confirmed the letters she had misremembered, and committed the full alphabet to a muscle memory that did not require looking at her hands. By Sunday, she had made a small set of cards from the heavy paper used for household accounts. She had asked, very specifically, for the spoiled sheets that would otherwise be burned, on which she had written letters and their corresponding handshapes in clear, careful ink. She did not approach Edmund with them directly. She left them, on Monday morning, on the side table outside his room while she was laying the East Corridor fire, in a neat stack, held together with a length of ribbon, with a single card on top that bore only 2 handshapes, the letters C and V. Her initials. She went back to the servants' hall and waited. Nothing happened that day. Or the next. She checked, on her corridor rounds, and the cards were still there, the ribbon undisturbed. She told herself this was not disappointment. She told herself she had not expected anything. She told herself she was a third housemaid in a great house with no particular claim on the attention of the family within it, and that she had done what she could and that was sufficient. On the third day, she was making up the east corridor fire at 6:30 in the morning. Too early, the house still dark, her breath visible in the chill, when a small folded paper was slid under the gap of Lord Edmund's door. She stared at it for a moment. Then she picked it up, unfolded it, and read, in a 12-year-old boy's careful, deliberate hand, 2 hand shapes drawn in pencil. The letter E. The letter A. Edmund Ashworth. Clara sat down on the corridor floor with her back against the wall, the paper in her hands, and for a moment she did nothing at all except feel something she would not have been able to name precisely but which had to do, she thought, with the particular way a locked door sounds when the key finally turns. The physician's visit was the Duke's idea, instigated. Clara learned later, via the careful intelligence network of the servants' hall, the morning after their conversation in the library. Dr. Fallow of Harley Street arrived on the following Wednesday in a carriage bearing his professional seal, a man of approximately 60 with the measured confidence of someone who has been consulted by the very important for long enough to have forgotten how to be anything but slightly condescending. He spent 40 minutes with Edmund. He emerged, Clara was told, rather paler than he had entered. The diagnosis, delivered to the Duke in the library, was a secondary infection of the residual scar tissue in the auditory canal, chronic, painful, and entirely treatable with the correct application of warm oil and a course of medication that had been available for at least the past 3 years. The fact that it had gone untreated for what appeared to be the better part of 7 months was, Dr. Fallow said, a significant oversight. Then Dr. Fallow paused. He set down his pen with the deliberate care of a man about to say something he would rather not say. The scar tissue, he said, with the reluctant precision of a man revising a position he had previously held with confidence, is not where we believed it to be. The nerve itself appears, and I must stress appears, Your Grace, as certainty would be premature, to be largely intact. What has been blocking conduction is inflammatory pressure. Chronic, compounding, and, a pause, not, in my current assessment, irreversible. The Duke said nothing for a long moment. You are telling me, he said finally, that 4 years ago, someone told me my son would never hear again. I am telling you, Dr. Fallow said, that 4 years ago, someone was wrong. The Duke received this. He thanked the physician. He paid the not insignificant consultation fee. Then he sat in his library for 2 hours and did not see anyone. Clara knew this because she had been assigned to bring the afternoon tray, and when she knocked and received no answer she had left it outside the door and stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was strictly her business, listening to the quality of the silence within. The specific, weighted silence of a man confronting something he had hoped might not be true. She walked back to the servants' hall and thought about her father, who had also been a man of particular silences, who had also loved without knowing how to show it, who had also, in the end, been too proud and too frightened to reach across the distance until the distance had become definitive. She thought, someone must refuse to let that happen here. And then she thought, that someone is apparently going to have to be me. She wrote a note. She deliberated over it for 3 drafts, each one more impertinent than the last, and then she wrote the final version in a single clean pass because she had found, in her experience, that the things worth saying rarely improved with excessive revision. Your Grace, your son has taught himself 7 letters of the manual alphabet in 4 days. He has asked me, by means of those letters, for questions, whether the warm stones help, whether I think the physician will come back, whether dogs can hear higher sounds than people, and whether I believe there is anything that cannot be learned if one is patient enough. I have answered all of them. I would suggest, respectfully, that his father might wish to answer some of these questions himself. He has, I think, been waiting rather a long time to be asked. CV. She left it on the silver tray with the evening correspondence. She was quite certain she would be dismissed the following morning. She was not dismissed. What happened instead was this. At 9 o'clock the following morning, as she was finishing the corridor fires, she rounded the corner to the east wing and found the Duke of Ashworth sitting on the floor outside his son's bedroom door, his back against the wall, his very expensive morning coat acquiring a quantity of corridor dust, with a set of Clara's hand-shaped cards spread across his knees and the focused, uncertain expression of a man learning something entirely new at a point in his life, when new things had ceased to be expected. He heard her footsteps and looked up. Clara stopped where she was. The Duke held up one of the cards. Made the shape, imperfectly, the fingers not quite aligned correctly. Looked at her with a question that had nothing to do with the card and everything to do with whether he was too late. Clara set down her coal scuttle. She walked to him. She gently adjusted his fingers into the correct position, the way she would have done for any student, meeting his eyes for a moment and finding there's something she recognized. The specific fear of a person who loves someone they have hurt through negligence and does not yet know if love is still accepted as a currency. The thumb, she said quietly, wants to come forward a little more. Like this. The Duke looked at his own hand. Adjusted. Made the shape again. From beneath the bedroom door came a small vibration. Footsteps, approaching, and then a pause, and then another folded paper slid through the gap. The Duke stared at it. He picked it up, unfolded it. On it, in Edmund's careful hand, were 3 letters, D-A-D. Clara stood very still and watched the Duke of Ashworth, who had served in Parliament, who had navigated 2 continental wars and the death of a wife and the governance of thousands of acres and the expectation of an entire class, press his fist against his mouth and close his eyes and make no sound at all. She picked up her coal scuttle. She walked, quietly, back the way she had come. She was called to the library again 3 days later. She had slept badly in the interim, not from anxiety, exactly, but from that particular restlessness that follows the completion of something large. The kind of restlessness that asks, and now what? The Duke was seated this time, which she took as a different kind of signal. He looked, not younger, exactly, but different. As if some particular tightness around the jaw had eased. As if he had put something down that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten its weight until the moment of setting it down. Miss Voss, he said. Your Grace. I have been considering, he said carefully, the particular nature of your position in this household and whether it is adequate. Clara kept her expression neutral. I was not aware of any dissatisfaction with my work, Your Grace. On the contrary. He folded his hands on the desk. Edmund has asked, by means of the communication system you have evidently established between you, whether you might be given a different role. Not as housemaid. As his tutor. Clara said nothing for a moment. He has also asked, the Duke continued, with the carefully controlled expression of a man who is slightly embarrassed to be relaying the communications of a 12-year-old, whether you will continue to sit on the floor with him when it is very bad. He says the stones help, but the sitting helps more. A brief pause. I believe what he means is the not being alone. Yes, Clara said. I believe that is what he means. The tutorship would come with a significant increase in your. It would be a different arrangement entirely. You would need to study, yourself, to stay ahead of him. He is exceptionally quick. I know, Clara said. He has already taught himself 11 more letters without being asked. The Duke looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Something quieter and more private than the previous conversations had contained. He told me, he said, that you asked him about pain in a way no one had before. That you sat beside him rather than above him. He stopped. Resumed. I owe you an apology, Miss Voss, as a member of my household who was not given the means or the authority to help my son in the way that you clearly saw was necessary, and who did it regardless. That required a particular kind of courage. One that does not generally get remarked upon. Clara thought of Mrs. Garrett's careful warning. She thought of 3 previous maids who had given notice. She thought of the corridor floor in the early morning and a boy's handwriting on a folded piece of paper. It did not feel like courage, she said honestly. It felt like the obvious thing. Yes, the Duke said. The obvious things are often the ones that require the most. A silence, not uncomfortable. Through the library window, the November garden was achieving, despite itself, a kind of austere beauty. Frost on the spent rose canes, the low sun turning the stone walls to something almost warm. Your son asked me one more question, Clara said. The last time we communicated. He asked why I had bothered. And what did you tell him? Clara considered it. She had told him the truth, which was this, because you were in pain and no one was looking, and I was looking, and once you have seen something you cannot make yourself unsee it. I told him, she said, that some things are simply not possible to walk past. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. I find they are not. He reached for the correspondence on his desk, an indication, in the vocabulary of the powerful, that the interview was concluded. The tutorship, Miss Voss. If you would consider it. I will consider it, Your Grace. That is all I ask. She took the position. By February, Edmund had mastered the full alphabet and was signing at a speed that forced Clara to study 3 evenings a week simply to maintain the conversation. By the end of that month, he had begun asking questions about mathematics, not the remedial arithmetic the dismissed tutor had attempted, but proper mathematics, the kind with variables and the satisfying weight of an unknown quantity balanced against its solution. Clara had not studied mathematics seriously since she was 14. She resumed immediately. She was not, therefore, entirely surprised when he came to find her one morning in late February in the schoolroom. She still thought of it as the schoolroom, and sat down across from her at the table and signed, quite simply, "No pain today." She signed back, "None at all." None. He looked, as she had thought he might, stunned, the particular stunned quality of someone who has carried a weight for so long that they have forgotten their own shape without it, and are only now discovering what they actually are when they are not bracing. She understood that expression. She had worn it herself, at 17, when she had finally left her father's house and felt, for the first time, what it was to breathe entirely without waiting for what might come next. Edmund signed something else then, slower this time, not because he didn't know the signs, but because he was choosing them with care. I could hear myself think. Is that strange? Clara considered it. No, she signed. I think it is exactly the right thing. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, she thought, the closest thing to contentment she had seen on his face. Not happiness exactly, which was a louder thing, but the quieter and more durable cousin of it. Then he picked up his pencil and returned to his mathematics, and Clara returned to her reading. And for a while the room held nothing but the scratch of pencil on paper and the comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped performing anything for each other. The first lesson the Duke attended was on a Tuesday in early March. He had not announced he was coming. He simply appeared in the doorway of Edmund's sitting room at 10 o'clock in the morning with his morning coat on and his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has decided to do something and is committed to the decision and is trying not to show how frightened he is of it. Edmund looked up from his desk. He and his father regarded each other across the room. Clara, who had been mid-sentence in an explanation of algebraic principles, went very still and waited. The Duke lifted one hand. Slowly. Made the sign for the letter H, then E, then L, then L, then O. His fingers were stiff with the unfamiliarity of it. He got the L wrong on the first attempt and had to stop and reshape it. Edmund watched this. His expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then he stood. He crossed the room, not in a rush, not dramatically, but with the deliberate, careful movement of someone who has learned not to trust the distance between himself and the things he wants. He stood in front of his father and looked up at him. And then, with the patience of a boy who had been teaching himself for 4 years in the absence of a teacher, he reached up and took his father's hand and rearranged the fingers into the correct position for the letter L. The Duke looked at his own hand, then at his son's face. Edmund signed the word back, Hello, perfectly, in one clean motion. The Duke's throat worked. He said nothing. He pulled his son into an embrace of the slightly awkward, effortful variety particular to men who do not embrace easily and are attempting it anyway, and Edmund, after a moment of visible surprise, put both arms around his father's coat and held on. Clara had developed, over the past months, a very reliable instinct for when a room did not require her. She turned to the window and looked at the early March garden, still brown, but with the first green suggestion of the roses returning along the bottom of the wall, and waited until the quality of the silence behind her changed from private to simply quiet. "Well," said the Duke, when he had recovered himself sufficiently. He sat down at the table, not at his usual remove but in the chair directly beside Edmund's, and arranged the hand-shaped cards in front of him with the air of a man settling in for something long overdue. Continue. It happened on a morning in late March, without announcement. Clara was reading aloud, a habit she had kept even after Edmund had made clear, through increasingly elaborate signed commentary, that he found her reading choices occasionally questionable. She read anyway, because the rhythm of it seemed to settle the room, and because Edmund tracked the movement of her mouth with an attention that had always seemed to her like more than lip reading. She was mid-sentence when he went very still. Not the stillness of pain. She knew that one intimately, the particular locked quality of a body bracing. This was different. This was the stillness of someone hearing a sound they had not expected and are afraid that if they move it will stop. Clara stopped reading. Edmund's hand came up slowly. He pressed it flat against the desk, feeling, she realized, for vibration. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not immediately name, because it was too large for his 12-year-old features to contain properly. He signed, very slowly. A word. She didn't recognize it at first. His hands were shaking slightly, which they never did. Then she understood. He was not signing a word from their shared vocabulary. He was finger-spelling, letter by letter, something he had not had occasion to spell before. V-O-I-C-E. You can hear my voice, Clara said. He stared at her mouth, then at her eyes. He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that is also a question, uncertain whether the thing it is confirming is actually real. Clara set down her book very carefully. She thought about what to say, what words, of all the words available, were worth being the first ones heard after 4 years of silence. She discarded several. Then she said, simply and without ceremony, "Hello, Edmund." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright in the way of someone who is not going to cry and is applying considerable will to that objective. He picked up his pencil. He wrote on the paper in front of him, not signed, wrote, in the hand she had watched grow steadier and more confident across months of practice. "It sounds different than I remembered." "Different how?" Clara asked. He thought about it. Then he wrote, smaller. "Closer. Better." She looked at that word for a moment. "Better," she repeated. He nodded. And then, for the first time in 4 years, in a voice that was rough from disuse and uncertain of itself, a voice that cracked on the second syllable and didn't quite find its footing, he said, "Better." Clara did not exclaim. She did not clap or cry or make it into the kind of performance that would have made him self-conscious. She simply looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, that's right. Better." And Edmund, who had not spoken in 4 years because silence had seemed the safest thing to stay inside, said it again, firmer this time, as if testing whether the word held the same weight spoken aloud as it did written down. Better. It did. She was not meant to be in that corridor that evening. She had only come to leave the dinner tray. But the sitting room door was open 4 inches, and what she saw through that 4-inch gap made her stop where she stood and not move again for a long time. The Duke of Ashworth was on his knees on the floor. Not in grief. She knew what that looked like in him by now. In something else entirely. Edmund stood in front of his father and was speaking, haltingly, unevenly, the voice of someone relearning an instrument they had set down years ago. And the Duke had both hands around his son's face and was listening with his whole body, the way people listen when they have been told they will never hear something again and are suddenly hearing it. She could not make out the words. The voice was too new and too quiet and too far away. She did not need to. She left the tray outside the door. She walked back down the corridor and permitted herself, privately and briefly, the particular feeling of a person who has done the thing that needed doing and watched it become, at last, real. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door opening, and light coming through, and knowing you were the one who had found the handle. On a Thursday morning in late April, the Duke came to find her after the lesson had ended and Edmund had been called away by correspondence from his aunt. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, the hand-shaped cards tacked to the wall now, the books on the table in organized stacks, the pair of chairs drawn close together that had not been close together when Clara arrived in November. The room looked, she thought, like a room that was being lived in. "He told me this morning," the Duke said, "that this is the first year he can remember not being afraid of winter." "That is very good to hear," Clara said. "He said it was because winter is when the stones are warmest." The Duke paused. "I believe he meant it metaphorically." "Yes, I think he did." A silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that has something in it, the way a room has something in it when a fire has been laid but not yet lit. The Duke stepped into the room. He did not sit, remained standing at the edge of the table, looking at the hand-shaped cards on the wall with the expression of a man who is about to say something that he has revised several times already and is not fully satisfied with any of the versions. "Miss Voss," he said. "Clara." She had not heard him use her Christian name before. She was quite certain it was not accidental. She waited. "I find myself in the position," he said, with the particular formality of a man who uses precision as a defense mechanism and knows it, of wishing to express something for which the conventional vocabulary is insufficient. He looked at the cards on the wall. Looked at her. You came to this house as a third housemaid. You are leaving it as my son's tutor. These are not the same category of person, and the distance between them is not something I take lightly. But neither is it. It should not be the end of the matter. Clara found that her hands, which she had trained over months not to betray her, had gone very still in her lap. You told my son, the Duke continued, that some things are not possible to walk past. I have been thinking about that rather frequently. He looked at his own hand, the one that had learned to make the shapes, and then at her. I find that I am unable to walk past what I have come to know of your character, your courage, and your considerable patience with those of us who require a great deal of it. You have improved considerably, Clara said, because she needed to say something, and this was the safest true thing available. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not yet, but its immediate predecessor. I have had an excellent teacher. He took one careful step toward her. I am not, at present, in a position to say more than this. There are proprieties that require time and patience, which you have told me is the thing. He stopped. But I wished you to know that I am aware of what this house has become because of you, of what I am becoming aware that I feel. Clara looked at him, this man who had learned to sit on corridor floors, who had rearranged his schedule to learn an alphabet, who had stood in the doorway of his son's room with his hat in his hands and reshaped a letter until he got it right. She thought about what it means to choose, repeatedly and without certainty of return, to reach across a distance. I am also, she said carefully, aware of a great many things. They regarded each other across the short length of the schoolroom table. Then Edmund came back through the door with his aunt's letter in one hand and a question already forming in his other. A sign that meant, roughly, are you still talking or can we do the geometry now? And they both turned to attend to him, and the moment folded itself away neatly, as moments do, into the ongoing fabric of a day. But it was there. It had been said. It would remain. Outside the schoolroom window, a thrush had found the newly uncovered section of the east garden and was conducting its preliminary assessment of the situation with the methodical thoroughness of an expert. The roses along the wall, which the new groundskeeper had pruned properly in February, restoring what years of neglect had taken, were opening in the April light. Small and stubborn, in no particular hurry about it. Edmund looked up from his geometry. He looked at the window. Then, with the casual fluency that had come so swiftly once the vocabulary existed for it, he signed. Still here? It was, in their private language, a greeting as much as a question. A checking in. The sort of thing one says to a room one has come to trust. Clara signed back, still here. She glanced at the Duke, who was reading Edmund's geometric proofs with the expression of a man who is slightly out of his depth and finds, to his considerable surprise, that he does not mind. He looked up, met her eyes, made the sign. Still here. Outside, the thrush began. Edmund went very still in the way she now knew, the listening stillness, the new one, the one that was nothing like the stillness of pain. He turned toward the window. He held it for a long moment, his pencil suspended above the page, his whole body oriented toward the sound the way a plant orients toward light, without deciding to. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, in that voice, still rough at the edges, still learning itself, I can hear it. Clara looked at the garden, at the roses opening along the old stone wall, small and stubborn, at the thrush, which had no idea what it had just done. Yes, she said, it's been there all along. She thought, it costs very little, in the end. Less than a new ribbon for a Sunday hat. Less than 3 drafts of a note. Less than 2 shillings and a letter to Derbyshire. Nothing more than the willingness to sit down on a cold floor beside someone who needs company more than they can say, and stay there until they believe you mean it. And she thought, that might be the only kind of love that holds. Leave a comment. Clara never asked for recognition. She simply looked when everyone else had accepted what they were told. Has anyone ever refused to accept a verdict about you? A doctor, a teacher, a family member who said something was permanent, and proved it wrong? Drop one of these words in the comments. The stones are still here, or someone was wrong, or better, it's been there all along. Share this story. Send this to someone who has ever made themselves invisible in order to help. A caretaker, a quiet friend, a parent who shows love through action rather than words, or anyone who has sat beside you on the floor when you needed it most. They deserve to know their kind of love has a name. Subscribe if this story moved you. If you believe the most powerful love is the kind that asks nothing in return and simply refuses to walk past, subscribe for new stories every week that find the extraordinary in the quietly overlooked. History is full of Claras. We intend to find them. A final question. Clara helped Edmund not because it was her job. It was, in fact, explicitly outside her job, but because, once she saw, she could not unsee. What pain in your own life, or in someone else's, have you been stepping around because naming it felt too large, too inconvenient, or simply not your place? What warm stone have you been waiting to offer?